In 2026, we are now at the 10-year mark of the adoption of the new urban agenda, which is set to run until 2036. And the new urban agenda is really a big deal, I think, because it is a framework agreement that was adopted by acclamation by all 193 countries of the United Nations. And that in itself is a big deal because it's an agreement essentially to achieve a form of urbanization that improves human well-being, improves planetary well-being, and does so with a lot of aspirations, along with the Sustainable Development Goals, a related document that was also approved by acclamation. And both of those documents are strong on aspirations and not strong on implementation. So the challenge remains, how do we implement these documents on the ground in local communities, local governments, local contexts that are often very different, at odds with the ability to harmonize those goals and to achieve those goals in different places. So what we're proposing is a project that we call Local Patterns for implementing the new urban agenda, and by extension, implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. And the project is intended to use the pattern language framework developed by the architect Christopher Alexander and used very effectively in many other fields outside of the built environment to focus on implementation processes within patterns, which are essentially encapsulations of best practice of the steps that you would take to implement, the steps you would take to build something that achieves particular goals of, in this case, the new urban agenda. As part of this process, we're proposing a scalable pilot project, at least to start with, that could ideally be replicated at larger scales and become more of a model that would use pattern languages that are drawn from the local context to develop implementation toolkits, essentially, local toolkits, local design specifications, local ordinances, codes, incentives, all the things that are needed to actually build something on the ground. So I'll run through what we see as a starting point, which is 16 what we might call proto-patterns or meta-patterns that essentially encapsulate the goals of the new urban agenda and also the Sustainable Development Goals that deal with city form. That then would be supplemented by local patterns that deal more specifically with local conditions and requirements, local needs, governmental processes, and so on. First of all, if you say, what is in the new urban agenda and how do we translate that into these proto-patterns, there are a number of consistent operational urban form commitments, public realm as the primary civic armature, including the streets. This is the way that all the private spaces get hooked up into the city and into the system of benefits that a city delivers ultimately. Urban form as an efficiency driver that reduces emissions, increases efficiency, cost-benefit equations, and so on. Agglomeration benefits, economic benefits. Compact and connected growth that avoids sprawling, fragmented urban patterns that have high cost, high externality cost, and that integrates new neighborhoods into a more efficient pattern. A mix of uses and polycentrism, in other words, this urban village concept that you don't have one big agglomeration, you have a series of large, medium, and small-sized centers within an urban region, within a national region or a global region, and mixed income is part of that as well. And then you have heritage patterns that are resources, a form of collective intelligence, if you will. These are assets that can be leveraged, that can give you enormous advantages in achieving the goals if you recognize them, protect them, and build on them. And then participation and co-production, that means platforms for meaningful participation, not just tokenistic participation and not just obstructive participation, I don't like what you've done, or, I don't feel that you've involved me meaningfully, or I don't know what I'm contributing, I'm just sort of going off the cuff and reacting rather than being an informed, educated participant, a meaningful participation. And then the SDGs already provide a measurement spine, the targets and the indicators, things like 11.4 on heritage and 11.7 on public space and so on. So what's the way forward here as we see it? Well, we are proposing 12 core urban form and public realm patterns that actually shape the outcomes in terms of the structure of the city, plus the enabling patterns, the ways that you get there through the governance, finance, implementation, and measurement and certification. So here's an outline of these 16 patterns, a kind of scaffold, if you will, 12 core patterns that deal with form and public space and heritage and opportunity. Streets as the spines of the public space networks. Streets are integral parts of the public space system. They're not the only elements. Obviously, you have squares and parks and other things, but they are the key spine, if you will, of the public space networks. And universal access to quality public space. In other words, there are barrier-free, not only to those who are mobility impaired, but who would be otherwise excluded for one reason or another. The places that are gated are obviously not public space in the same sense as places that are truly open and public. So we want to make sure that there's adequate, truly open public space. Compacted, connected growth, where you infill first and then you extend. You don't leapfrog over areas that are too low density, fragmented, undeveloped. You want to make sure that you proceed in an orderly way doing compact and connected growth. And then again, a mixed use and polycentric structure, the idea of urban villages that are all within the polycentric network, each of which has components of daily need within it, ideally within walkable pedestrian shed, or at least easy to get to within a short period of time without high cost of vehicular travel or time or other impacts. And then a mixed income neighborhood fabric, integration and cohesion of different populations within the community, not just a monoculture of the wealthy or a monoculture of the low-income populations, mixing those folks and providing opportunity for everybody to benefit from the interactions with each other. And then transportation choice, as I would term it, everyday mobility and transit integration, lots of ways to get around, walking, vehicular, bike, public transportation, and so on. Productive neighborhood economies means that you're fostering the ability to have knowledge spillovers, creative ferment within the neighborhood, ability to have local exchange and local livelihoods. Jane Jacobs wrote about this a lot, and the importance of diversity and mixing and economic opportunity. Civic places for social mixing and co-presence. This, we know from the research, is very important, to have places where people can encounter others in their neighborhood and get to know them, get to check in on them during a crisis, creating those bridging ties, those weak ties, not just the strong ties of family and workplace, but the weak ties of the third places and the neighborhood. Turns out to be very important to address not only social isolation and depression and loneliness, but also this is a form of resilience when people are dependent on their neighbors to help them in a crisis. Cultural heritage as a living asset, as a kind of collective intelligence, if you will, that is not only something to preserve as a kind of relic of the past, but a living asset that can be reincorporated, that can be protected, that can be built upon, adaptively reused, and so on. Human scale built form, obviously at the scale of the pedestrian and the sidewalk and the building edge, the edges of public space that have to accommodate the human experience, human ability to perceive, to be permeable, to move through those spaces, to have safety and comfort, something that Christopher Alexander and Jane Jacobs talked about a lot, especially for streets and for public spaces. Nature integrated urbanism, meaning green-blue systems, in other words, building on the infrastructure that's already there, the natural water systems and the vegetation and other assets that are there, enhancing those, building on those, adding greenery to the city as a form of biophilia, something that is also a value in the city, and also a benefit for resilience, things like flood protection when you're able to allow more infiltration of the water and reduce runoff. And related to that is the idea of risk and heat resilient urban fabric, spatial strategies that are going to reduce vulnerability by lowering the heat island effect, using cool colors and reducing pavement areas that add to urban heating, making the buildings narrower, creating shading and greenery, and so on. And other forms of risk reduction. Flood control, obviously, is an important one. The ability to protect against other kinds of disasters. And then the next section is actually enabling patterns that provide for implementation and verification. So co-production platforms would institutionalize the participation, and again, using a pattern model as a form of community programming, envisioning, creating the basis that will feed into an actual code, an actual ordinance, the actual delivery mechanisms for the community. And then value capture for the commons. This is a very important area and a very critical problem right now, that the commons, the public spaces, are often seen as externalities in the calculation of a business model, the economic return of buildings, the real estate value of the buildings. And there's a need to recognize that there is a benefit, a public good from those common spaces that also translates into an economic benefit. And we need to be able to translate that into a mechanism that can reinvest that value, that can monetize that value and reward the private sector for working with and creating and reinforcing some of those public spaces. So this idea of value capture is very important. Rules that encode the patterns. So this is where you translate the patterns into the regulatory structures, the form-based codes, the performance standards, the implementation mechanisms, economic incentives, and so on. And then finally, measuring what you build. Don't start out with the measurement and just build to a number. What you want to do is use the measurement as a feedback mechanism that gives you reinforcement, that tells you what to do right and what maybe you should course correct and do differently. You don't start out with the measurement, you start out with the goal, and you use the measurement to track your progress and course correct if you need to. So then finally, how you matrix those patterns to the targets and the verification. One way to do that would be to build in to each pattern a set of targets and indicators. It could be 11.4, 11.7, and so on. This is something that we'll be working on. And then we could use 3 tiers of evidence. One would be spatial metrics, GIS. It could be remote sensing. It could be things like measurement of public space, the connectivity, the land consumption. Then another tier would be the outcome and the metrics, things like safety and inclusion, the degree of participatory structures, the safety of public spaces, the prevalence of harassment and crime, and so on. And then the third tier could be governance and finance commitments, the investment into heritage protection and other assets, the adoption of plans and policies that are consistent with the UN Habitat monitoring work streams that already exist. And then in order to actually build those into the pattern, we could have 3 maturity levels, if you will, for each of the patterns. Level 1 would be those patterns that are adopted into policies, codes, and specifications. Level 2 would be those patterns that are delivered into built projects that demonstrably embody those patterns. And then finally, level 3 would be performing those patterns. The indicator thresholds have been met and maintained through the confirmation of the metrics. So this would be the pathway from pattern language to implementation to reporting that would be credible, that would harmonize naturally with the Sustainable Development Goals, the reporting conventions, and the urban monitoring frameworks. So this is early days in the process. There's a lot more work to do to flesh out these patterns and to certainly write the local patterns, organize the methodology for doing that. But we think we have a good starting point, and we welcome others participating in this project, giving us feedback, collaborating as this goes forward.